Okay, starting. That's starting. Not necessary that you totally finish. We're not going to go through. Okay, 2 more verses. Matthew 24.
Ooh.
You have your Bibles, turn to Matthew 24. I'm just saying this for the sake of the camera, so there's not a lot of blank air when we go through this. Okay, so let's pray. Let's pray real quick. Dear Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together and to study your word. Lord, I pray that you would give us an extra amount of grace as we study this verse that has divided your church. I pray that we would not be divided over unnecessary things. Lord, I pray, God, that you would give us your mind and your will for this. And we just ask this, that your Spirit would be here. We say this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I wanted to have you go through chapters 23, 24, and 25. And if you've been through chapters 23, 24, and 25, you know that they kind of hang together, especially kind of more the last half of 23, 24, and 25. The end of Christ's denouncement of the Pharisees, and the reason why is because I'm not going to be able to go through and exegete every passage of this, the whole thing. I'm only going to be able to hit the highlights. So what I want to do this evening is I want to do 2 things. And then next week I want to do one more thing. I'm going to guess that we're only going to have time to go through these 2 things, okay? So the first thing that I want you to do is I want to take you through the major eschatological positions regarding Matthew chapter 24. What are the different ways people in the past have interpreted Matthew chapter 24? And then I want to argue for a position that's becoming very popular very quickly, known as Orthodox preterism. And I actually want to try to convince you of Orthodox preterism. And that way, if I've convinced you of Orthodox preterism, I know that I've put the best foot of theirs forward. And then next week, what I will do is then I will go in and show you the weaknesses of what's called Orthodox preterism. The reason why I really want you to understand Orthodox preterism is because many people, particularly when they're kind of coming out of non-Reformed churches and then into Reformed churches, you know, the first thing they kind of get down are the 5 points of Calvinism. That's kind of the big deal. And then the next thing that kind of happens is they've been disillusioned over popular end times eschatology. And so preterism, Orthodox preterism, just seems to devour these people who kind of come out of this, come out of the regular rank and file popular church. And so I want you to see why, and I want you to understand their position, the strength of their position, and also then I can start knocking it down. But I'm going to convince you of it. I mean, they've got a really good, solid position, which it looks real good unless you know the weak spots. It looks really good. And you're going to be walking out of here going, well, maybe that's the right biblical position to hold if I've done my job correctly and if we're all open-minded to what the Bible has to say, okay?
I'm relieved because when you said preterism, in my mind I was thinking dispensationalism.
Oh.
So it scared the daylights out of me.
Well, I don't think you're going to be...
Even our church is against preterism. Right.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm for... I don't hate Orthodox preterism, okay? Orthodox preterism, you understand there's 2 kinds. There's Orthodox and unorthodox.
Oh.
I don't hate, it's a good biblical position that's been around for a really, really long time. I mean, a really long time. You can find early church fathers interpreting portions of the scripture in a preteristic fashion, okay? So let's go through the major positions, then I will argue for Orthodox preterism. So the first one is futurism. Now you're going to see that many of these positions look a lot like what we did when we talked about the book of Revelation. We talked about futurism, preterism, historicism. There many times, what you believe, actually most often, what you believe about the book of Revelation is kind of what you believe about Matthew 24. You believe like Matthew 24 is Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Olivet Discourse, and the book of Revelation is John's Olivet Discourse, kind of a thing. So a lot of people believe that that they hang together, including myself. What I believe about the book, about this, is the same kind of thing that I believe about what we went through with the book of Revelation. Okay, so there are two major views, and that is dispensational.
Yeah, this was on the first class you ever taught us.
And then the second view is, I will say, non-dispensational. Non-dispensational futurism. So these are both futurists. Now, the difference is that in all dispensational futurists, they all believe that what's happening in Matthew chapter 24 happens in a 7-year period known as the Great Tribulation, sometime in the future. Okay, that's the belief that they have. Now, under that, you have a bunch of sub-beliefs. So yeah, at least five major views. Some of them are popular, some of them aren't as popular. The first one is the pre-trib. Okay, so the pre-trib looks at this as a time where where the church has been taken off the earth, and there's only Christians there as a result of being a convert during that time. The second one is mid, and then the mid is the belief that because they believe that you have 3.5 years and 3.5 years, that they don't believe that the church is taken off until the Antichrist breaks that covenant. And in the middle of the 3.5 years, the church is there during that first 3.5 years, and then it's taken off. And then the second and the third one is post, right? Which is that they suffer all the way through the tribulational period, this 7-year tribulational period. And then the fifth one, fourth. Thank you, I can't count. The fourth one would be, I would say, dual. There are some people, dual or trial. I've heard that before too, where some people think, well, some people are taken off pre-trib, and then some people are taken off mid-trib, and then some people are taken off. Some of the movies, older movies, follow that line of thinking. Like, okay, like John Hagee believes this. He's really big into eschatology. He will sit there and say that there's a rapture before the tribulation, there's a rapture in the middle of the tribulation, and then there's a rapture at the end of the tribulation. And then the fifth view, well, it's dual try, because sometimes people only believe two. Okay, because honestly, if you would make it to the end, yeah, that's a rapture, but it's the rapture after everything's over. Yeah, so the fifth one I would say this is the best one, pre-wrath. That would be the closest one I believe in. But for me it's a moot point, because we're all asking, this happens in a 7-year tribulation in the future, which I don't believe in a 7-year tribulation in the future.
You can't say, we've argued this before. You said you believe in pre-wrath?
Pre-wrath, I believe that the 7 bowls of Revelation that are God's, which are actually officially called God's wrath, that He removes the church before He pours those. But you see, but you don't believe that you don't believe that happens before. You don't believe that happens after everything else. You believe that the church is taken off before the tribulation. Yes. This isn't that. Okay. This is that you suffer through the trumpets. You suffer through what? No, the bowls are the end. What are they? I forgot. The trumpets.
The bowls.
The plagues. And everything else. And then you're only taken off. This group believes you're only taken off at the last 7 bowls. So the church suffers through all of that except for the last 7 bowls. That's not the same as pre-trib.
Well, to me, that suffering is wrath. That's what, to me, and I think to them it is too.
I get it, but you believe that you're pre-trib. You believe that all 7 years.
Yes, because that way they will not suffer.
Okay, but I'm telling you that this view doesn't believe that.
I know.
This view believes that they suffer through all the tribulation except for the 7 bowls.
Right, so you and I have a different definition of wrath.
The rest.
Now I understand why we disagree.
Got it.
Okay.
Well, there are different kinds of wrath, I would say.
Now I get it.
Okay. Non-dispensational, non-dispensational futurists 1 and 2, and this is the cults, and then I would say Orthodox. Okay, a lot of Christians are here. The cults here would be people like the Jehovah's Witness.
C-U-L-T-S, not cuts.
C-U-L-T-S, sorry.
That's okay.
Cults. And and the Orthodox. The cults here, this would be like the Seventh-day Adventists. This would be the Christadelphians. This would be the Jehovah's Witnesses. This would even be the Mormons, to some degree, would fall into a futurist. Now, the big difference here with the cults is that in all of their systems, they really believe that eschatology happens within their system. You know, it's like everything is focused on the Jehovah's Witnesses, or everything's focused on good Seventh-day Adventists, or everything's focused on good Mormons, or something like that. So it kind of, yeah,
just the good ones.
Right. It unfolds within their framework. Orthodox futurist non-dispensationalists, and there are some popular ones out there. My friend Robert Morey was a futurist when it came to this, and he's Orthodox futurist non-dispensational. Got that? Non-dispensational, non-cult, and he just believed that this happens sometime in the future. That Matthew chapter 24 happens at some point in the future to us. All right. So that's the futurist position. Those are all futurist positions. The second position is the preterist. The preterist position. Okay. And the preterist is obviously divided into A and B. Orthodox. Sure.
Is the fact that they believe in the 7 years is what makes it dispensational?
Yes. And that some idea of the church being raptured out at some point also makes it dispensational. Okay, that's not the only thing that characterizes the whole system, but that's a defining feature. Especially this one, when it first came out, everybody was pre-trib, and then as this dispensational started to change over the years, and you started getting mid and post and dual and trial and pre-wrath and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So Orthodox, we're going to go 1 and 2 here as well. So the first position, now Orthodox preterism believes that the majority of Matthew 24 is talking about AD 70. That's the big deal. In other words, it was future at the time Jesus gave the prediction, but it is past to us. Okay,
So it was prior to AD 70.
That it all happened by AD 70.
70 AD.
Yeah. Now they differ a lot as to where you draw the line, as to when Jesus is talking about the past and when Jesus is talking about the future, because they still believe in the future coming of Christ. That's what makes them Orthodox. They still believe Jesus physically will return at the end of the age. So that's why they're not unorthodox. Unorthodox preterists, and I'll come back to this. Unorthodox preterists are unorthodox because they don't believe in the physical return of Christ. They believe everything happened in AD 70, the whole book of Revelation, everything in Matthew chapter 24, everything in Matthew chapter 25, all happened in AD 70. Okay?
Do true Christians believe that unorthodox preterists are also Christians?
No. Orthodox preterism is called unorthodox because it's not orthodox. It's not Christian. I would say ultimately this is not a Christian position. This is an unchristian, heretical. There's always a difference between the guy who went to seminary who's teaching it and then the 18-year-old who's kind of following it as a lackey. Okay? So the 18-year-old who's following it as a lackey may be deceived and tricked and that kind of stuff. If he's truly a Christian, he'll come out of it. Okay? If he's truly a Christian, he'll come out of it. However, the guy who's 4-year, went to seminary 3 years and knows this stuff, and he's teaching that Christ is not going to return physically, bodily, is going to hell. That person is on his way to hell. That person is not accepted among Christians. Okay? I mean, I find it to be damnable heresy to not believe in the return of Christ.
Okay, how about Orthodox preterism?
Well, Orthodox preterism believes that
No,
a
I'm
lot
saying
of
the
this.
Christians believe that Orthodox
Yes,
preterists
a
are
lot of
are
Orthodox
Christian.
Christians are preterists, are
Okay.
partial. A lot of them.
Okay.
It's becoming the growing trend. As new Calvinism's kind of growing, people are getting into Orthodox preterism. It's becoming a fast-growing trend to get into Orthodox preterism. I was an Orthodox preterist for a long time. So let me give you the divide here. The majority of Orthodox, and I find the ones that are they're most popular for sure, but they're also the ones that I think are most reasonable. They split it down at Matthew 24 verses 36. So if you look at Matthew 24 and verse 36, actually if you start in verse 34, it says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows." So they would say that everything from verse 35 up is about 80, 70. And then when he says, "but that day," so he's talking about a separate day. So they would say, "but of that day, no one knows." So everything from verse 36 onward is still future. Okay? Now then I'm just going to say miscellaneous, okay? Because there are other Orthodox preterists who believe that some of the rest of Matthew 24 is still talking about 80, 70, but Matthew 25 certainly isn't. Okay, Matthew 25 is certainly talking about the return of the Lord. But where you draw the line, whether you draw the line at Matthew 24 verse 45 or 48, it really kind of almost depends on the preterist. It really almost depends. It's almost idiosyncratic. Okay, it just depends on the preterist. Most of them fall here. This is where I was. This is what I'm going to be arguing, that everything from 36 backwards was about 70 AD, and everything from 36 onward is still future, even to us. Okay? All right.
When you went to Bible college, were you a preterist then?
When I started, yes.
When you started,
Actually, yeah, I was almost all the way through it until after my master's degree, and well into my doctorate, that I was
a preterist.
still a preterist,
That's
a
a-
partial preterist.
Couldn't
Okay, I
have
want you to
answered
think
that
that
because
partial
Yeah,
partial
because-
preterist, not this kind, this kind. Okay, you got that? Okay, I just
So
want to
you
make
can
sure
be-
everybody
so
understands.
you can be
I
a-
was never in this school.
I got it. So
Okay.
you can be a partial preterist, yet be a Calvinist then.
Most Calvinists are partial. I mean, a lot of, okay, so I don't know any, let's should say this. I don't know any Orthodox preterists who are not also 5-point Calvinists.
Oh.
I don't know one of them. Now, not all 5-point Calvinists are Orthodox preterists.
Right.
Got that? But I don't know one. If you think about all R.C. Sproul, Gary DeMar, Greg Bahnsen, all these people who come from what's called the School of Reconstruction, they're all 5-point Calvinists.
Okay.
All of them are 5-point Calvinists. Then Orthodox, obviously, the belief is that Christ isn't going to come back. Everything happens in AD 70. Nothing here is about the end of the age at all. All right, now this leads us to our final, and I'm going to put miscellaneous, because there are several views that don't fit in with any of this stuff. Okay, but I'm only going to talk about two, and I'm going to put 1 and 2 rather than A and B, because they're not subsets of each other. They're totally different views. They're miscellaneous, and the first one is dual fulfillment. Second one is church age theory. And that's where I'm going to land, okay? Because next week when we come back and I talk about this, I'm going to talk about what I believe.
But
So,
this is a repeat of what you first started on. Right?
no, because kind of. It's
Yeah.
very similar, but there are some differences.
Okay.
So, for example, there's no historicist view when it comes to this kind of a thing, because all the historicists are over here. okay? Because they believe it's telling church history, and of course, when you get to Matthew 24, that's still future. So they become like half preterist, half futurist kind of a thing, kind of. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's kind of what they believe. So the dual fulfillment view, this is really people who cannot deal with the arguments of the Orthodox preterists, but they still really want a future. They still really want this future, and so they see it kind of as a dual fulfillment. They say, well, there must be two I gotta have the abomination of desolation be in the future. I learned that my whole life, and I just can't get past the fact that it might have been in the past, but even though the text clearly says that it happened in the past, and I can't argue against all these argumentations, and so I think there's a dual fulfillment. That's kind of where these people land. They're just a dual fulfillment. And then the church age theory is the theory that what Christ is describing here is the entirety of the church age, characteristics of the church age, including AD 70. Including AD 70.
You think the miscellaneous are also heretics?
No.
Okay.
No, these are not. There's only one view up here that's a heretic. Well, I would say this one.
Oh yeah, of course.
The cult ones are heretics too. They're
What does it say about the church age?
What Christ is describing the church age?
that he's describing the church age from their day to our day. Okay. From their day to our day. So those are your major eschatological positions. Are you good on this? Can I erase this and can we start into?
I think because we're going to be watching the video, you should put a circle with an X in the middle for the unorthodox.
With the unorthodox, all right.
And,
Should I draw horns on it too?
yeah, and for the cults.
Okay. We hate them.
You
Well, we
got it.
love them for Christ, but
Right.
we hate their
Love them
belief.
in the Lord, but hate their belief.
Right. Okay. There's a- This miscellaneous, there's lots of different views out there that you're going to find that don't fit anything. It's almost to a person, though. Like one person will write a book and it won't fit any of the prior positions. And there's just tons of them out there. Okay, so how many of you, like me, when you first heard someone say, you may have only heard it the first time from me, heard somebody say that this Matthew 24, particularly up to verse 36, is about the destruction of Jerusalem. Even verses like immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from the heaven and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. How many of you, when you read that and you hear somebody say, I believe that this is about AD 70, think that that is just pure nonsense and pure nuts? You say, why in the world would anybody believe that this is about AD 70, okay? Why in the world and the destruction of Jerusalem? I was in that same camp until I heard some people expound the position and what it believes. So today I'm going to talk to you about why people like this believe this. But it's a little bit of a magic trick, okay? It's a little bit of a magic trick. There's a lot of truth in the position. And I'm going to unravel
Nero, right?
next week what is true and what isn't, okay, about this.
Truth because of Nero, right?
I'm going to leave Nero out of it.
All right.
I'm going to leave that. That's more of a discussion for the book of Revelation, but it would cross over at some point. So now the position that I'm going to be advocating for here in the rest of this class of Orthodox preterism says that from verse 36 prior is everything in that verse is all about AD 70. But from verse 36 onward is about the return of the Lord. Okay? And the destruction of Jerusalem in particular. And verse 36 onward is about the return of the Lord. But everything prior to verse 36 is about AD 70. So why would somebody believe that? Why would somebody believe this? Okay, so first of all, it fits the immediate context. Look at verse 23 and chapter 23. And notice, you know your chapter divisions are not inspired, right? Okay, that we're just getting one kind of uninterrupted flow of thought until another uninterrupted flow of thought. And he's giving these 7 woes on the churches. So here's the first reason. The first reason is that it takes into account the immediate context. That's the first reason. It takes into account the immediate context. It says, therefore I send, verse 34, it says, therefore I send prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barak, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. That was the generation that he was speaking to, the scribes and the Pharisees. And then he says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus left the temple, and going away, when his disciples came to point to him the building of the temple, he answered, you see all this, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now this is clearly about his prediction of AD 70. He's saying, your house, all this is going to come upon this generation. Your house is left to you desolate. Then he points back at that building. They say, whoa, whoa, whoa. His disciples are, wait a minute, the temple can't be destroyed. He says, not one stone here will be left upon another. Not one stone. They will all be thrown down. By the way, in AD 70, when Titus invaded Jerusalem, they burned the temple, the gold melted in the temple, and they literally took every stone apart to get all the gold out. Okay? Now look at what happens is as he sat on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, and they're asking him, okay, they're saying, tell us, when will these things be? Well, what he just said, the destruction of Jerusalem. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, you have to understand that they are confused about the destruction of Jerusalem, his coming, and the end of the age. To them, this is all jumbled together. They're Jews living prior to the crucifixion, living prior to the resurrection. They knew that there was going to be a future age, in the resurrection. They talk about this, when Jesus says that he can raise Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus' sister says, I know that he will be raised again in the resurrection. So they believed that there was going to come a time when this world was going to be over and there was going to be another world that begins. But to them, it was all confused. They thought that the destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of the end of the age were the same thing, and the end of the world. They thought that there's no way you could have the temple destroyed and it not be the end of the world. That's what's going on in their mind, right? And so that's not the case, though, right? The temple can, but we have this same mentality. People think that if America falls, then then Jesus is coming back tomorrow. Well, America could fall, and Jesus could not come back for another 1,000 years. Okay, people thought that about Rome. Oh, there's no way Rome could fall and it not be the end of the world. They're thinking the same thing. So part of what they're asking, at least we would have to admit, is about the destruction of the temple. And any attempt that any attempt that places an answer in Jesus' mouth would have to be just bizarre, outside of AD 70, because obviously they're asking about AD 70, so you got to think that obviously he's going to address part of what they're asking. They are asking about when this temple is going to be destroyed. So at least some of his answer has got to deal with that. Or otherwise he's just going to ignore it. I mean, otherwise you got to think that he just ignored that answer. They want to know this stuff, but I just got through telling them the temple's going to be destroyed. They just asked me about it. I'm going to talk about something else. I don't think that's happening. I think obviously he's telling them about the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's the immediate context. The immediate context is him pronouncing this generation's destruction, his prediction of the temple, of the temple's destruction, and their question, which in part concerns the temple's destruction. Does everybody following me at this point? Okay. The second reason is the strength of the time text. This generation. Look at verse 34. So everything that's happened up to this point, he's telling them about everything that's going to happen. We'll go back to that. But the second reason why is the strength of this verse here. Just like he said to the Pharisees, this generation, all the blood is going to fall upon this generation. He says, now he just got through explaining all the stuff about this that we've read. He says, but in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until how much? All these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But notice what he says in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Okay? So did they ask about the end of the world? Yeah, they did. They said, and when's the end going to be? And did they ask about the destruction of Jerusalem? Yeah. So that seems to me to be a real good indication that everything before, he's answering their first question, and everything after is answering their second question. You know how it is. If you've been a teacher of anything for any sort of time, people can be confused and have more than one string of thought that they bunch together, and you've got to unstring it. You've got to say, well, this is this part, and this is this, and they don't really belong together. Okay, this is this part, this is this part. But notice what he says here in verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation, not that generation. If he was speaking of the future, he would not have used the demonstrative pronoun, this.
Right.
He would have used a far away. He said that generation. Now, every time in this book, when he uses that term, this generation, he uses it several times, it's always a reference to the generation of his hearers.
That's probably their reasoning then, because of this generation.
That's right. Well, I'm telling you the reasons. I'm saying one, it fits the immediate context. The second is the strength of this verse. It says this generation. Turn to chapter 11 and verse 16.
Matthew?
Yeah, Matthew. This is all Matthew. So the background here is he's talking about the ministry of John the Baptist, and he says, but what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace calling to their playmates. Now, what is that generation that he's talking about?
What verse were you
Verse 16, Matthew 11, verse 16. But what shall I compare this generation? Right? What shall I compare this generation? He's talking to them. He's talking about them. In chapter 12 as well. And verse 38 and following. It says, then some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. And he answered them, it is an evil and adulterous generation that seeks for a sign. Now he's talking to them. He's saying, you're an evil and adulterous generation. but no sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, who were the people whom he's talking to? His immediate audience, not a future audience. His immediate audience. It says, the men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah. But behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came to the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. There are other verses. Now, just to summarize this, every time this generation is used, he is talking to the immediate audience. There is no exception. There is no exception to this. So when he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day, no one knows. So you see, it's that separating those two questions out. What about the destruction of Jerusalem? What about the end of the age? And he's saying, look, these two things are separate. This is all going to happen before this generation, and this is all still future to us. The other thing, now let me anticipate 2 objections you'll hear to this, because this is so strong that people scramble to get out of this. Futurists of all stripes scramble to get out of this. And they've come up with 2 really bad arguments. And the first argument is they'll say that generation can also mean race. Well, it doesn't. They're 2 different Greek words. They have similar roots, but they're not the same. So don't let anybody tell you that. It's the difference between genos and genia, and it would be like the difference between genealogy and generation. If I said this generation, I don't mean that you can't supplement this genealogy.
Right.
If I say this generation, I mean this generation, right? Just because the words are similar and have a similar origin doesn't mean that one can be substituted from the other. The other way that they've tried to get out of this is by looking at verse 32. It says, look at verse of Matthew 24 and verse 32. It says, from the fig tree learn this lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. And what they'll try to do is they'll try to say that the generation that Jesus is talking about that sees all these things is the generation alive at the rebirth of Israel as a nation. And that the fig tree is supposed to represent Israel being a nation. And so they'll still say it's future, but it's the generation of the fig tree. However, this is a problem when you read this with the corresponding verse in Luke. So turn to Luke chapter 21. In verse 29, it says, and he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. Okay, so in the other account of this, he's not saying that this. He's saying it's just a parable. He's saying you look at a fig tree. He says look at the fig tree and all the other trees. So all the other trees aren't a bunch of nations being reborn again. Okay, he's just using a parable here, saying when you see the fig tree, you see its leaf put forth, you know summer is near. This isn't the generation of Israel being rebirthed as a nation. By the way, that has failed miserably. If you look at what a generation is, this is where all the predictive prophecies come in, like 88 Reasons Christ is Coming Back in 88. Do you remember that? Were you around in 88?
Oh, yeah, I have that book.
You do?
Yeah, I'll bring it sometime.
88 Reasons. That's based on this idea because the generation is so many years and it was supposed to be 88. And then when they didn't do that, they said, well, now it's 89. Yeah. And then it was the Rapture Report, 1989. It was a 90. Then it was 90. Then it was 91. Then it was, and now it's even 40 years from now because Trump just put Jerusalem back as the capital
Yeah.
when he moved it. So then now they're saying, see, now it's going to be 40 years from now. Because
Do
it's a
they
generation.
believe there's
So they're always
2006
moving the
Do they believe there's
goalposts.
2019 reasons now?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay,
All right.
now this also, now here's the third reason. This view would also fit some other very interesting passages that I'm sure you've read, and I'm sure you've gone, boy, I don't know what that means, but I know someone somewhere knows what that means. So, especially in Matthew. So turn to Matthew 10 and verse 16. I know I did.
Is it Matthew 10:16 or Matthew 16:10?
It's going to be 10:16, and then it's going to be 16:28.
Okay,
So,
got
all right. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in the synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, and bear witness before the Gentiles, and they will deliver you over. Do not be anxious what you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speaks, but the Spirit of the Father is speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now he's talking to his disciples there, the people who are hearing him. Now look at chapter 16 and verse 28. Now this is why some liberal scholars said that Jesus predicted the end of the world and he was just wrong. And the Orthodox preterists come in and they say, no. See, we're saving the day from the liberals. See, the liberals say that Jesus predicted the end of the world, he was just wrong. Say, no, what Jesus was predicting was the end of the nation, and in the book of Daniel, when the Son of Man comes to his kingdom, is he coming this way or this way? In the book of Daniel. That way. See, he's coming that way, all right? And
I don't know the liberals and the conservatives have a different view of the Bible in terms of eschatology.
What?
You just talked about liberals.
Yes.
Okay.
Liberals don't believe the Bible.
Oh, I see what
They
you're
believe
saying.
that Jesus was wrong. 16.
Oh.
But let's look at
Those liberals.
1628
You're talking
real
about
quick, because we
progressive
got a lot.
liberals. All right.
A lot. I'm talking about old school liberals.
Okay.
For what will in 28? Okay. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here, who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Mhm.
Now have you what's that?
It's going up, not coming down.
Yes, right. But have you looked at that before and gone, well, what's going on? And they will say the sign that the Son of Man is coming in his kingdom is the destruction of Jerusalem. That's his ultimate vindication. That way of worship is done away with, and we are now in a new era of God's economy. So, obviously, there's some type of eschatological stuff happening here. Now, here's the fourth reason. The fourth reason is that it is obvious that some of the things happening here in verse 24 were fulfilled in the lifetime of the apostles without a doubt. Okay, we all see this. Beware of false Christs and false prophets. Did they deal with false Christs and false prophets?
Yes.
Did brother betray brother to death in their day, under the persecution of the church, under the Jewish persecution and the Roman persecution? Yes, obviously. Were there earthquakes and famines in that day?
Yes.
The book of Acts records an earthquake in Acts chapter 16 and verse 26. And in Acts chapter 11, 28, there's a famine so severe that the rest of the churches have to send money to the church, have to send goods and money to the church in Acts. So obviously there are some things about this that took place. Now, here's the big rub that everybody has a problem with. It's like, okay, I got it. This generation, it fits the immediate context. They're asking, obviously Jesus has to answer their question. It fits that context of this generation. It fits with other passages about the coming of Christ into his kingdom. Of course, they dealt with many of these things, but people will still say, but it seems like there's stuff here that they didn't deal with, right? Like the stars falling and Christ coming on the clouds of heaven and all that kind of stuff. Well, it seems that way if you don't understand how this language was used in the Old Testament to speak of judgment on other nations that didn't literally happen, okay? So what they'll look at here is things like this one. The abomination of desolation, that's one that they'll look at. They say, oh, that's got to be future. The stars falling from heaven, the gospel going out to the world, that kind of stuff still seems to be future, right? I mean, if you just read it, it just seems like it's going to be future. But we got to deal with this verse that says, but all these things, it doesn't say some, does it? It says all these things will happen to this generation. So how do these preterists deal with this? Well, they deal with it by looking at places in the Old Testament where this language is used on other nations and it didn't literally happen. So, for example, turn to Isaiah chapter 13. And this is God's judgment on what nation? Babylon. Verse 13, verse 1. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. And then it goes, on a bare hill, raise a signal, cry aloud. Which verse am I looking for? Look at verse 10. Let's go down to verse 10. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark as the rising, and the moon will not send its light. I will punish the world of its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to prompt and arrogant, and I will lay low the pompous and ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold. Anyway, you see that, is that you? It's not me.
No, it's me.
I didn't think it was mine because I don't recognize that.
Leaning against the table, making it vibrate.
So, in God's oracle against Babylon, the nation, he uses this type of apocalyptic language to show the end of a nation. Okay. Also look at Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 1. This is his oracle concerning Egypt. His oracle concerning Egypt. It says, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them, and I will stir the Egyptians up against each other. So here's this idea of God himself, Jehovah, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Yahweh, riding in on a swift cloud. Did those things literally happen, or is that a cataclysmic way of saying that God is going to bring this into this nation? That's how they argue for this. This happens in the Old Testament over and over again. Ezekiel's chapter 32, in his...
Ezekiel 32.
Yes, Ezekiel 32, verse 1 through 8, in his declaration against Egypt here. In the 12th year and the 20th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, rise and lament over Pharaoh, king of Egypt. You consider yourself a lion of nations, but you are like a dragon in the seas. You burst forth in your rivers, trouble the waters with your feet. And I don't know. Anyways, it goes on for a little while here. In verse 7, let's look at verse 7. But I will blot out, I will cover the heavens, I will make the stars dark, I will cover the sun with clouds, the moon will not give its light, and the bright lights of heaven I will make dark over you. I will put darkness on your land, declares the Lord. Now, to further this argument, what is Israel likened to in the dream of Joseph? Sun, moon, and stars. What are most nations represented as on flags? Sun, moon, or stars. A combination of some of those things. So when we get over to Matthew chapter 24, and we read these more apocalyptic type things, and he's just talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, all the preterist is saying, see, these images are used to condemn other nations in the past. Why wouldn't Jesus, being a Jew, and this isn't then interpreted here because this is a Jewish audience would have heard this. Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven. And it doesn't say the Son of Man. It says they will see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It doesn't say the Son of Man. It says they will see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And a loud trumpet, and stars will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. If he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, wouldn't Jesus use similar language that God has used already to other nations that he's destroyed, right? I mean, that makes sense, right? You would have understood this if you were a Jew. You would have seen sun, moon, and stars being darkened. You would have thought God's judgment on Babylon, God's judgment on Egypt, God's judgment on these other places. Okay, you would have thought those things as well. Well, what about some of the other verses here? That's more the other ones. Now look at verse 15 of Matthew chapter 24. So turn back to Matthew chapter 24. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let one who is in the housetops not go down and take what is out of his house, let the one who is in the field not turn back and get